So good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those joining across the globe. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Elliot. I'll be your host for today. We're thrilled to have you all here, whether you're joining live or you're seeing this recorded after the fact. We appreciate that you took the time out to share your attention with this session. A couple of housekeeping items, because these are the most commonly posted questions. We are recording this for sharing after the fact. If you miss anything, you'll always be able to review this content down the road. We encourage you to ask questions as conversational as we can make it in this format. Please put those questions in the chat. I'll try and read them, and we'll pause in between like agenda items. If there are any technical issues on your end, you can always try refreshing your browser, and you can always check the chat too. People can get you unstuck. And again, we'd love to hear from you. So as we go through, we want this to be as germane as possible. Participation is encouraged. The speakers today, I'm going to be the first speaker. I'll cover the agenda, and then we'll move to our second speaker, Satya Singh, who's Scispot's CTO and co-founder. He'll be covering maybe the most interesting part. I'd like to begin with a bit of framing, some context to get started. And I want to use an example that should be familiar, although it might date me a little bit. Yeah, you could probably work backwards and figure out why I have this example. But for those of you that signed up for Netflix really early on, right, it was a transition away from going to the local video store or going to like Blockbuster. And what you would do is you'd go to their website. They had a good library, pretty good web interface, and you could create a queue of 1 to 3, or you could pay a bit extra, maybe get 5 films mailed to your house. You'd then go grab them from the mail slot, enjoy your films, and then eventually return them. You didn't get your new films until you'd taken care of the ones that you took out. And start to finish, this was probably a 72-hour exercise in a lot of cases. It was nice that you could hold on to them and there weren't any late fees. But if you compare that to what is, standard now, I don't think anyone blinks an eye at streaming. So we want to kind of draw out some of those comparisons, what the investment in infrastructure or the underinvestment in infrastructure means for day-to-day operations in pathology labs, and how there still is a real dedicated human element and certain steps that seem, out of place and out of time. Let's take a look at our agenda. So we're going to go into sample management workflows, and we're going to try and break them down into their moving parts and how we categorize things. We're going to then take a look at lab flows. This is our proposed solution, connected and automated. These are sample-centric workflows. Then we're going to see automatically generated lab insights. Following that, there'll be a brief survey, and then there's a dedicated time in our agenda for questions and answers from the audience. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Scispot's co-founder, our CTO, Satya Singh.
Brilliant. Thank you, Elliot, and thank you for that example of Netflix, and especially people who used to rent those DVDs back in the days would resonate with the example Elliot gave, and also how things have changed in the last decade when it comes to streaming. In terms of LIMS as well, the things are changing, but we need to acknowledge the problem before talking about what the solution is or how this whole workflow can be optimized. And I think traditionally, most of the LIMS have been built to solve yesterday's problems. And with the volume of samples that have been increasing, especially in pathology labs, the workflow that's been evolving, I think we need a better solution to solve some of those challenges as well. So what are those problems? Well, over the last 3.5 years, what I've seen, that pathology lab follows a traditional workflow of order registration, sample accessioning, sample processing, and then report creation. At a very high level, these are the basic steps. But in most of these steps, if you think about these steps as a funnel, you'll start noticing that they are disconnected. So starting with order registration, when you typically receive the order either through emails or through websites, or if they're manually entered through a CRM or a database, most of the record capture is done through manual or human going in and essentially like registering that order, which is okay. But when you start the accessioning part, you then start creating sample IDs, and you want to make sure that that's connected to your top of the funnel, which is orders. But that disconnected, clunky workflow results into like a manual QC check that compromises the sample traceability and accuracy. And as you kind of keep going throughout that funnel, so as you start aliquoting, assigning barcode IDs, and then finally get to sample processing, that fragmentation starts to kind of get bigger and bigger. So for example, if you are manually creating test samples or transferring data to and from instruments, you start creating significant gaps when it comes to sample chain of custody. And some of these post-analysis QC checks, in terms of the readings, in terms of the results, it gets harder and harder to make sure that the standards are met. And you can do those checks based on the reference ranges that you might have for a particular test result. And as you start kind of accumulating the errors and the manual input to each of these steps, the biggest disadvantage is losing the data integrity, because ultimately, if you're a lab technician, you want to make sure that the data integrity is maintained right from the order registration all the way towards like as you get closer to report creation. And finally, as you're kind of creating reports, you tend to like a lot of lab technicians, if you're doing this manually and have a very clunky workflow or have a clunky system, it becomes harder for you to like understand where the likelihood of errors would be or how to fix those errors if they occur at what part of the chain of custody. And I think the absence of automation is the main reason of why this problem gets bigger. And ultimately, like as a lab technician, you want to ensure that there is accuracy and traceability of your sample data. So you don't kind of, it doesn't lead into inefficiencies or any delays that you might be running against, because ultimately throughput and making sure that the report and the delivery time is on point and you're meeting the deadlines of your particular lab. So these are the problems that I've seen over the last few years, especially. And I think the volume of samples and the throughput as it increases, these volume is not only like increasing the problem exponentially, but also causing a lot of quality checks that a lab technician has to do manually at every stage of the process, at every stage of this workflow. So we'll talk about like some of the things you've seen that helps solve this problem, and also talk about how some labs have implemented automation at each of these steps. And then also talk about lab flows, which is Scispot's platform that helps you kind of automate this workflow end to end. But for now, like before we move on, we decided to do a short survey so we understand like what problems the audience are facing, how much they resonate with some of the things that we called out. And then based off that, we can kind of tailor what automation would make sense in this webinar. So I think if we move on to the next slide, I can then start the survey. Awesome. So you will see a survey on your screen. I would really appreciate if you select your biggest challenge, because that would give us a sense as we get into the solution and start sharing some of the automation that you've seen that can help you streamline your workflow. That's awesome. Yeah, I think there's a lot of folks who replied, so thank you. And I think in terms of the results, I'm seeing automating sample intake and registration is the biggest pain point. So good call out. I think that's definitely the biggest challenges that I've also witnessed based on anecdotal data. So it's good to validate that. And then I'm seeing a tie between automating data analysis and post-analysis QC check, and also the report creation, which kind of makes sense because both of them are connected to each other. If you don't have good QC checks in place, it's harder to like do report creation or sending reports. So that makes sense. And then I think 15% of the folks talked about automating instrument data management and QC related to that. So thank you for sharing that. I'll definitely cover some of the sample intake and registration. So we'll stress upon that as well. And then we can talk about some of the QC checks and the report creation as well. Okay, so we talked about the challenges, and you also gave us like validation in terms of what challenges you've seen. In terms of the solution, I've seen like various ways to connect this workflow, especially like starting from sample registration to accessioning to processing to automating the report creation as well. And one thing that I see that is a kind of connective tissue throughout this workflow is chain of custody, having some sort of unique identifier that helps you connect this workflow throughout. So that's where kind of Scispot comes in. Scispot LIMS is designed as a modern data tool, so you can easily connect this workflow starting from order registration all the way to report creation. And what it does is like think of this as ontologies, or think of this as like graph data, if you will, where everything that you do throughout the workflow not only has a unique identifier, but it has a journey that you can trace. So it has complete traceability, it has complete chain of custody. So as you're registering samples, as you are aliquoting them, as you are assigning them to test, or as you're doing your QC checks, or even rerunning some of these tests if the QC check fails, or getting data from the instruments, there's a connective tissue that links all of that together rather than you going and like finding out, hey, where did the sample came from? Or how do I connect my instrument results back to this metadata that I had? Or how do I make sure that there's traceability or version history as I'm progressing through multiple tests and some of the tests might not pass based on the standards that I put in place. So this is where this helps. It also helps kind of as you're kind of barcoding the samples, you can retrieve them. So search and discovery becomes easier because the whole trail is connected. And there's trace for like everything that's happening within each of these orders and registration process. And since most folks in the survey talked about that the issue is at top of the funnel, when I actually show the product in next few minutes, I'll definitely stress upon like how to automate top of the funnel, meaning order registration, the sample registration piece, and how that gets connected as part of lab flows. So we call this platform lab flows, where the lab technician essentially can create runs, lab flow runs, to stitch all of this data together in one place. And then there's knowledge graph associated with it. Think of knowledge graph as like your ontologies. So you can visually like see how things have progressed, right? Whether that's pertaining to one particular order or whether that's specific to one particular sample, so it's easy to kind of slice and dice that information based on whatever ID you need to slice and dice by. And ultimately, as we started rolling this out over the last few years, we've noticed that the cycle time from order registration to report creation goes down. The quality of data improves, so data integrity also gets better. But in a nutshell, it makes lab technician lives easier because as data integrity is in place, lab technician knows that how things are progressing, so they can focus on actual test results, on actual QC, or actually validating what they're working on, rather than aggregating data or assembling different data points together in one place. So that's been the biggest advantage of using lab flows. And if you move on, one of the things that we've also layered on top of lab flows is be able to like generate charts. So think of this as like AI-enabled charts where lab technician, they don't need to write SQL queries or Python scripts to be able to say, hey, show me the status of reports grouped by clinic or physician, or hey, help me kind of slice and dice my data for the distribution of test request by sample type. So all of that can be done through like a simple natural language prompt. And think of this as like a layer on top of your lab flows. So whatever's happening in your lab flows platform, it automatically kind of helps you do business intelligence on top of that. And not only that, it also suggests you like what dashboards or what analytics make sense based on the workflow you're running. So depending on the type of lab you're running or depending on the type of samples you're running, it has that context. So it can basically even suggest what analytics would make sense for your day-to-day runs. So that was a high-level overview. I'm going to go into the product shortly. But if there are any questions, I'm going to pause for a minute. Feel free to ask questions on the Zoom chat, and we'll try our best to answer them.
All right, I'm going to pause my sharing and pass the baton over.
Awesome. So I'll go straight into the product as promised. As always, feel free to like interrupt or ask questions. as I'm going through this. And let me share my screen. Brilliant. So I mentioned about lab flows. I think we talked about the challenges and also talked about how connecting your complete chain of custody can help you increase the quality of the data that you're collecting, but also help you build the ontologies into a knowledge graph. So that's where lab flows kind of bring all of that together. And the idea is that as you create your sample management run, one of the key aspect was that order registration and sample registration, linking that together is the biggest problem. So Scispot has automation in place where you get like automated databases in the background, so you can easily connect your orders to samples. You can even write scripts as you're kind of going through. So if you do the same run over and over again, every time a new order comes in, it would automatically like get connected in a run, and you can register samples associated with it as well. But I'm going to show you like a step-by-step workflow. So I can register my order. I can then also like bring in samples. Again, you have templates of different databases associated with each of these steps. And the idea is that there's minimal clicks that are involved to connect these pieces of the workflow, but also help you automate the pieces that are run frequently. So day in, day out, as a pathology LIMS lab technician, if you're running the same kind of registration process over and over again, all of that can be simplified in a workflow. And same thing applies to like aliquoting from the sample. So if you follow like a pattern for how you create aliquots for your working samples, that can also be automated within the system itself. And then same thing for the test. So let's say like if you have certain tests that you want to run on any of these working samples, those tests can also be templatized. And how can that help? That helps because you don't want to create anything from scratch that can disrupt the workflow that you have. Obviously, you can create new templates, but if there are aspects of this workflow where you allocate certain samples to specific tests, most of those tests can be automated throughout the process. And I can select what samples I want to assign to those tests, but also get a feedback loop as I get results in. I can do my QC check as well. So yeah, these are some of the examples that I have in the workflow. The other thing is Scispot also lets you kind of choose report templates based on the test you've chosen. So let's say if you do a specific test for some of the orders and you want the report to be templatized in a format that only aligns with that QC test that you're doing, or only aligns with, let's say, qPCR instrument that you're running, that report can also be templatized. So you get exactly that format that you're looking for. The other aspect of this workflow is you can like do multiple runs. So if the QC check fails and if you want to do another run, that can also be kind of branched out from your existing workflow. And you can see the version history of that. And then as you're doing all of this process, you get triggers and notification. So for instance, Scispot is Zapier partner. So you can like through Zapier plugin, send automated alerts on Slack, through Gmail, through 6,000 plus apps, essentially. So doesn't matter what type of tool you use inside within your company or within your lab. It's very easy to like build notifications at each of these steps. So the lab technician, lab manager, or any operations person within your lab gets notified on any of these steps that are being executed within the lab. And then lastly, as I mentioned, like you can run dashboards on any of the databases that you have in Scispot. So those are all kind of natural language based, and AI suggests you what data makes sense, how to slice and dice that data. And then Scispot also has Copilot called Scibot, so you can ask questions and see latest changes or your latest runs, what the version history has been, what is the chain of custody for your particular samples or your particular orders or your test. And all of that can be summarized through a simple natural language interface as well. So yeah, that was kind of brief overview of the product. And I'm happy to take any questions. But one last thing I want to say is thank you for sharing the results of the survey. It kind of validates some of our anecdotal data as well. And we do acknowledge how hard it is. Like if you don't have your sample registration kind of tied together, the downstream part of the workflow becomes more challenging. So I hope this presentation was useful.
We have a special space carved out for questions, and then there's sort of a surprise at the end. Okay. There's a question. So Richard asks, do you integrate with qPCR machines and automate the calculation of CT values? Which parts of this workflow can you automate? That's a good question.
Yeah, great question. So qPCR machine, so there are two aspects of it. One is like exporting data, the other one is importing. So we can do both. So Scispot has multi-well plates that we support. So you can easily export data from Scispot, have that in your qPCR run. And then once you get the results, you can then import it back into Scispot. This can be done in an automated way or semi-automated because some lab technician prefers to do this in a semi-automated way so they can check the readings before uploading it back to the LIMS system, or you can automate that completely as well.
That's flexible. Yeah, that's really good. We'll leave another moment for questions before moving on. Very good. So this is where we'll tend to close. Yeah, we got a little bit of assist from the Scispot agent from Scispot. Let me see if I can get this audio to play. Of course, if we have questions, we'll also try and answer those.
Register, process, analyze, report, tasks unending of every sort. Samples everywhere in the lab, they float on air. Register, process, analyze, report, tasks unending of every sort. Fear not, dear scientist, hold fast, for Scispot's here to ease the blast, automate, streamline, make it right, turning chaos into light with data integrity at its core. Process is smooth, errors no more, collaboration, compliance too. Scispot's here to guide you through. So breathe deep, let go of stress. In Scispot's hands, you'll find success. From sample start to reports end, a trusted partner, a lab's best friend. Samples everywhere.
Thanks, everyone.